Yes. Rise of Nations, Rise of Legends. A game with a name that's unnecessarily long and a following that's small but devoted. Released in 2006 by Big Huge Games as a pseudo-sequel to their previous game Rise of Nations, Rise of Nations, Rise of Legends, which I'll now just be referring to as Rise of Legends, is a game cut from the same cloth as its predecessor. It inherits a lot of the core mechanics of Rise of Nations, but also does a lot to stand out from it, with the fascinating change of the game's setting departing its historical roots and instead taking part in a fantastical steampunk world full of inventive machines and fearsome monsters. Rise of Legends was a unique twist on a much beloved title, though it doesn't just differ itself through setting, it also does it through gameplay. While taking a smaller scale, it's able to give more time and focus to specific mechanics, whereas Rise of Nations' time-spanning escapades forced it to not give as much attention to all of its separate elements. Despite receiving a very positive critical response, however, Rise of Legends only sold about a third of the copies as its older sibling, inherently not giving it as wide of a fan base today as compared to a lot of other classic titles. Despite all that, I've received more than a few requests to take a look at how it holds up today. So that's what we're going to do. Let's see if you should play Rise of Legends in 2019. Despite Big Huge Games' insistence on that this is in fact a game in the Rise of Nations series, initial inspection made me somewhat question that claim. My first impressions felt that it was very much unlike its forerunner, with major differences like the inclusion of a campaign mode, the much narrower scope, and the death of historical accuracy, with its uniquely fantastical setting being the significant ones. But out of those three, in my opinion, Legends contrasts itself most with its scale and overall scope. While most would probably say the biggest difference is in its setting, I actually don't agree. When I think of Rise of Nations, I think of how it takes you through a voyage of technology, beginning with the rudimentary use of basic tools, and ending with total supremacy over all of its elements. The fact that Legends cuts out all of that and replaces it with a more traditional snapshot of a time and place is to me why it felt so different to the original. Sure, it's got Rise of Nations in the title, but it doesn't feel like what I'd expect an entry in the series to be like. But despite this immense change to what I consider to be the core tenet of the series, once I played a few hours I actually started to notice holdovers that had been carried along to Legends, such as land borders, passive resource generation, and horizontal research trees. But the biggest and most obvious one is the return of cities, and they've been upgraded to play more of a primary role in your faction's growth. Rather than just a place to recruit workers and increase your borders, they now act as hubs for development. To unlock new research, increase economic strength, and increase your population cap, districts can be added to make each city a modular system, determined by what you want to focus on. If you're pushing for a strong economy, you might want to build more merchant districts to speed up the rate at which you gain wealth. Or, if you're already sitting comfortably, you could focus on military to increase your population cap and increase the defensive abilities of your city. The fun part is that you can have multiple cities and you can tailor each one's development to whatever you need. Adding districts is also the pathway to upgrading your nation, allowing for advancements in the form of new research and technologies with every new district you add. An interesting side note here is that you don't really need to manage civilians at all, unlike nearly every RTS in existence. Buildings build themselves, and resource gathering structures recruit their own workers and assign them automatically. While you can control them to some degree, such as, say, to move them to a new mine or attack an enemy, you honestly don't need to. As long as the mines are filled, you'll be sitting pretty. Another change that may throw Rise of Nations fans off is the fact that you only find 3 playable factions compared to the 25 available in Nations. And while that may feel like you're getting shafted in terms of choice, the actual differences and variations in what's available here is leagues better. While the 25 in Rise of Nations could often blur together, the 3 available in Rise of Legends are different not only in their units and research, but also in their mechanics. While the Vinci are the classic human-only faction, they're unique in their use of technology, building powerful and ingenious machines to bolster their armies and cities. The Island, on the other hand, are magic users, using the powers of sand, fire, and glass to face their foes, and at the same time they include many sentient species other than humans in their society. Lastly, the Quaddle are advanced civilization who worship and are ruled by aliens, with the benefit of using their advanced and bizarre technology to crush anyone who stands in their way. It's fair to say there was a lot of thought put into these 3 factions, and their strong distinctions in gameplay and visuals add a lot of variety to what at first could be seen as a lackluster offering. As for modes, I mentioned earlier that Rise of Legends includes a full story mode, contrary to Rise of Nations' complete lack of one. And to my surprise, it's actually not half bad. It's split into 3 separate campaigns, but all follow the prized Vinci inventor Guacamo, and his journey starting as an inexperienced leader who's forced into rule after his brother was assassinated. Each campaign features one of the game's factions, so you'll get a good knowledge of what the game has to offer if you'd rather do that before jumping into the skirmish modes. It also uses a mix of traditional RTS gameplay and a Risk-style game board, which keeps things from getting stale. The narrative itself is pretty bare bones, but it does its job well enough. Once you get onto skirmish, it's about what you'd expect, with traditional RTS base building and the clashing of armies big and small. One thing I noticed is that when making a game, there's not many options when compared to Rise of Nations. Where's the game speed, resource quantity, population cap, or more game modes? Maybe I'm nitpicking, but these feel like pretty obvious oversights when it comes to an RTS with the Rise of Nations in its title. Once you do get into a game though, the experience of building your cities and armies is quite enjoyable. There's a good amount of progression in terms of technology and research, and the variety offered by all the factions' various units helps to keep combat diverse and interesting. Legends also features a few unique elements that help it stand out from its contemporaries. For example, there's a Warcraft 3 style hero system where you can call in special units that level up and have powerful abilities. And another is the dominance system, where nations who are the most dominant in any of 4 specific avenues can use a distinct ability to assist them. Like being able to take control of enemy units through army dominance if you have the strongest military. All combined, a game of Rise of Legends can be a lot more complex than you first might think, and that adds a lot to its potential replay value. With its unusual setting, it's fitting that Rise of Legends' units, buildings, and overall visual design is equally distinctive. With Command & Conquer Generals being the most recent RTS I've taken a look at, seeing Legends' crazy and varied units was a really good breath of fresh air. Because you're not just getting fantasy elements here, you're also getting steampunk, an entirely separate style all on its own. With units like the Vinci's Clockwork Men to the island's Glass Dragons, each faction oozes with personality in its visuals. But unfortunately, for those who have a soft spot for Rise of Legends in their hearts, most of what else I have to say about the audio-visual experience isn't so positive. Let's start with the sound design. It is not very good. I didn't have super high expectations coming from Rise of Nations, but Legends still disappoints me with its effects. Some of them are okay, but the sound of units fighting in particular is just so weak. To show my point, listen to this clip. It's got infantry and Clockwork Men battling an opposing force, and see what you think. You can hear there's just not much to it. And it's a shame because a lot of the units look like they should sound awesome, like the Clockwork Men, but they just don't. As for the soundtrack, while it doesn't blow me away, I think it's probably the best part about the game's overall audio. Some of the tracks are quite memorable, and they're exactly what I would imagine a fantasy version of Rise of Nations soundtrack would sound like. And now it's time for the graphics. Oh, the graphics. Well, the visual effects, models, and the textures are actually, in my opinion, pretty good for the time it came out. As well as having some really creative environments and building design, what stands out like a sore thumb are a lot of the unit animations. Kinda weird, I know, but bear with me. Now, at first, I thought I was just imagining it, but after asking some friends and doing some side-by-side comparisons, I'm sure of it. A lot of the units are animated at a less than 30 FPS frame rate. This makes these particular units look super janky and out of place, especially next to ones that are animated at a much higher FPS. Have a look at this comparison on screen and you'll see what I mean. It's pretty obvious. Now, I found no way to fix or change this, so if you know something I don't, Please let me know. I've looked online but just can't seem to find anything. And if it is what I think it is, there's really no way to fix it, because those animations are going to be baked in at that frame rate. This single downside alone makes the game feel old and clunky, especially when it's next to units that are animated correctly. It just doesn't look or feel right. And it's such a shame too, because it drags down what would have been an honestly pretty nice looking game considering when it came out. And I can imagine how much better everything would be if all of its elements were at that same level of quality. Rise of Legends is in a tough place right now. It's a creative game with a unique setting, and I have no doubt that it deserved the review scores and the praise it received when it was released. But in today's world, I just don't think it fares nearly as well. Unlike a lot of its contemporaries released before it, Legends has not received any sort of remaster, re-release, or HD upgrade. The version you'd play today is the same one you'd play 13 years ago when it came out. And that's a shame, because my main issues with the game, like its visuals and sound effects, could be overhauled and upgraded to a quality that could bring up the whole game experience by a decent margin. And while there's no shortage of people asking for it, so far we've had no news. The IP though is now in the hands of Microsoft, who did recently release the Rise of Nations Extended Edition, so I feel like there is a glimmer of hope that we may see something in the future. The other massive issue with playing Rise of Legends in 2019 is its availability. Because unless you've got a disc copy, there's literally no other legal way to play it. There's no digital release, no freeware download, nothing. Now, I'm not one to advocate acquiring a game through, let's call them, back channels, but when there's literally no other option except for buying a used copy off some dude from Amazon, I wouldn't be too concerned about people acquiring it in other ways. Plus, when most people are buying games digitally now, and the fact that a huge portion of PCs and laptops don't even have disk drives, it's more and more likely that people are going to use these avenues to play older titles like Rise of Legends. So all I can say is that I hope Microsoft puts in a bit of effort and gives this an HD remaster, so people can at least have the option of playing it legally, and at the same time enjoy a classic that's been enhanced for the modern day. If we do in fact get a remaster at some point, then I'd hopefully have a different tone when talking about playing it in 2019. But as it stands, it's difficult to get over its shortcomings in its visuals and availability, unless you're really itching for a fantasy RTS that isn't Battle for Middle-earth 2, or you've got some really high level nostalgia that needs satiating. And while it does have its positives, and I can't say I didn't have some fun while playing it, in my opinion there's just better options out there. But if you still enjoy it, then don't let me stop you. Thanks so much for watching everyone. If you still play Rise of Legends, let me know down below. I'd love to hear some thoughts from people who still play it. Thanks again, see you next time.